The afternoon sun poured through the large windows of the mansion, casting long golden rays across the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of polish and fresh flowers. The maid moved quietly through the hall, her hands wrapped around a damp cloth as she dusted each corner with care. She had worked in this house for nearly 6 years, never once leaving a smudge or a streak behind. Her daughter often came along after school, sitting quietly in the back corner of the living room while her mother worked. The little girl didn't complain. She knew her mother worked hard to keep the house clean and the family happy. While her mother scrubbed, swept, and wiped down tables, the girl would do her homework or draw on scraps of paper she found in the recycling bin. But what she loved most was watching the piano in the center of the room. It was a grand piano, shining black with golden pedals. Every time she saw it, she felt a pull, like something inside her wanted to reach out and touch it. Sometimes, when no one was home, her mother would let her sit on the stool for a few minutes. She wasn't allowed to play, but she could look and she could imagine. Her small fingers would hover above the keys, pretending to press them down, whispering soft tunes in her head. Her mother always smiled sadly and said, "Maybe one day." The girl didn't ask for more. She just nodded and dreamed. One afternoon, while they were cleaning the living room, the lady of the house walked in. She was elegant, dressed in white, and her shoes made sharp sounds against the floor. "Make sure everything is spotless tonight," she said firmly. "We're hosting a small gathering for some guests. There will be a pianist and a few singers. Everything must be perfect." The maid nodded quickly, clutching her cloth tighter. "Yes, ma'am. It will be ready." The little girl looked up from her corner, her eyes wide. "A pianist?" she whispered. The woman didn't notice her. She was already giving orders about decorations and catering before walking out of the room again. When they were alone, the little girl turned to her mother, excitement bubbling in her chest.
"Can I stay and listen tonight?"
"Please," her mother hesitated. "It's not for us," she said gently. "You know how these events are. But I won't disturb anyone," the girl said quickly. "I'll sit in the hallway. I just want to hear." Her mother sighed. She couldn't say no to those hopeful eyes. "All right," she said softly. "But you stay quiet. No moving, no talking, just listen." That night the house came alive. Cars lined the driveway, and the sound of laughter filled the rooms. The smell of perfume, champagne, and roasted food floated through the air. The maid moved swiftly from one corner to another, making sure everything looked perfect. The little girl stayed hidden behind a tall curtain near the hallway, peeking out just enough to see the guests arriving. They were all dressed beautifully. Men in suits, women in gowns, their smiles polite and practiced. The grand piano sat in the middle of the room, its lid open like a dark wing. Soon the young pianist arrived, a tall man with neatly combed hair and confident hands. Everyone greeted him warmly, calling him talented and brilliant. He smiled modestly, soaking in their praise. The little girl leaned forward, her heart racing. When the pianist sat down and began to play, it was like the whole room changed. The noise disappeared. The conversations faded. Only the music filled the space, graceful, rich, and alive. Her eyes widened as his fingers danced across the keys. She had never seen anything so magical. Each note seemed to tell a story, one she could feel deep in her chest. Her mother saw her daughter's expression from across the room. She felt a mix of pride and worry. She knew her daughter loved music, but she also knew their lives were far from that world. Music lessons, instruments, and concerts, those things belonged to people with money, not to cleaners and their children. She turned away before the feeling could sting too much. After an hour of music and polite applause, the performance came to an end. The pianist stood up, smiling as the guests showered him with compliments. The little girl was still in a trance. She clapped softly from behind the curtain, her heart still racing. She had so many questions she wanted to ask him. How did he learn? Was it hard? Did he ever play when he was sad? As the crowd began to mingle again, she stepped forward without realizing it. She wanted to see the piano closer, maybe just touch one key. But before she reached it, her mother's voice called quietly, warning her to stay back. She froze, her heart jumping. The pianist noticed the small movement and smiled politely. "Oh, who's this?" he asked kindly. The lady of the house turned and gave a little laugh. "That's just the maid's daughter," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "She's always hanging around when her mother cleans." The girl's cheeks turned pink. She wanted to disappear, but she stayed still. Her eyes were still fixed on the piano. The pianist crouched slightly, looking at her. Do you like music? She nodded shyly. I love it, she said softly. I always listen when someone plays. The lady of the house chuckled again. Oh, how sweet. Maybe one day she can learn when she's older. The girl hesitated, her small voice trembling as she spoke again. Can I play it for my mom? The room went silent for a second. A few of the guests looked at each other, amused. Then came a ripple of laughter. Not cruel, but sharp enough to sting. Someone whispered, That's adorable, and another added, She probably thinks it's a toy. Her mother's face turned pale. I'm so sorry, she said quickly, pulling her daughter back. She didn't mean anything, please forgive. But the girl looked up at the piano again, her eyes full of something the guests didn't understand. It wasn't pride or boldness. It was love. Simple, innocent love for the sound she had just heard. The pianist raised his hand gently. Let her try, he said. His voice was calm, but the lady of the house laughed nervously. Oh, come on, she said. It's a beautiful instrument, and she's just a child. What if she scratches it? I'll watch her, the pianist said. Just 1 minute, the maid froze. She wanted to say no, to save her daughter from more laughter. But her daughter was already stepping forward, eyes wide, hands trembling. The room watched in silence now, waiting to see what would happen. The girl stood in front of the piano stool, barely tall enough to sit comfortably. Her feet dangled above the pedals. She looked at her mother once, a small nervous smile on her face, and then turned to the keys. Her fingers hovered over them, afraid to touch. For a long second, nothing happened. Then she pressed one key, and soft, slow. The sound floated through the air. She pressed another and another, creating a tiny, fragile melody. It wasn't perfect. Some notes were too hard, some too soft. But there was feeling in every touch. The guests stopped whispering. Even the lady of the house went quiet. There was something in the way the child moved, something honest. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just playing what she felt. Her mother stood frozen near the doorway, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't care if anyone laughed again. In that moment, she saw her daughter as she truly was, full of light, full of dreams. When the little tune ended, the girl turned quickly toward her mother, smiling shyly. I told you I wanted to play it for you, she said softly. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer before a few polite claps began. The pianist smiled kindly. You have good ears, he said gently. And heart. That's something you can't teach. The lady of the house nodded stiffly, pretending to approve, though her face showed surprise. The other guests murmured small compliments before turning back to their drinks and laughter. The moment passed quickly for them, but for the little girl and her mother it didn't fade. It was the first time she had touched a real piano, and the first time her mother realized her daughter's gift wasn't just a dream. As the night went on, the girl sat quietly again, back behind the curtain, but her eyes glowed with a spark that hadn't been there before. Every sound, every note from that piano now belonged to her. She didn't know it yet, but this small, awkward moment, the laughter, the silence, the single chance she was given, was about to change everything in her life. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The laughter, music, and chatter from the night before had faded, leaving only the soft ticking of the wall clock. The maid walked through the living room, picking up empty glasses and folding napkins. Her daughter followed behind, carrying a small trash bag, still thinking about the piano. She couldn't stop hearing the sound of the keys in her head. The way they made the air move, the way people had gone silent even for that small moment when she played. It felt like a dream, but also something real, something she didn't want to lose. Her mother glanced at her and sighed quietly. You shouldn't have done that, my dear, she said softly, not unkindly. People like them don't understand. They think it's funny when someone like us tries to do what they do. The girl looked down. But I just wanted to play it for you, she whispered. You never got to hear me before. The maid stopped for a moment, her heart tightening. She remembered that tiny smile her daughter gave her right before she played. There was no shame in it, only love. She reached out and touched her daughter's hair gently. I know, and I'll never forget it, she said. But you must be careful. The world isn't always kind to people who dream too high. The girl didn't fully understand what that meant, but she nodded quietly. Still, a small flame had already been lit inside her, and she didn't want to let it go out. Later that afternoon, the lady of the house called the maid into the sitting room. She was sitting with a cup of tea, flipping through her phone. "About last night," she said without looking up. "Please make sure your daughter doesn't interrupt the guests again." "It's not appropriate." The maid bowed her head slightly. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. It won't happen again." The woman waved her hand, still focused on her screen. "It's fine. She's just a child." But the guests found it amusing. "Let's not have a repeat of that." When the maid returned to the kitchen, her daughter looked up from the small stool where she sat waiting. "Are you in trouble?" she asked quietly. Her mother forced a smile. "No, just nothing to worry about. Finish your homework." The girl nodded, but her heart sank. For the rest of the afternoon, she sat by the window, watching the sunlight fall on the piano in the next room. She could almost feel it calling her name. A few days later, the family hosted another evening event, a smaller one this time, mostly close friends. The same young pianist was invited again. He greeted everyone warmly, and when he spotted the maid's daughter near the hallway, he gave her a quick smile. She blushed and ducked behind her mother's arm. That night, the house filled once more with laughter and the smell of good food. The guests were chatting, glasses clinking, when someone suggested the pianist play something lively. He agreed and began a cheerful tune that filled the air like sunshine. The little girl, sitting quietly near the doorway again, swayed softly to the rhythm. When he finished, everyone clapped. The lady of the house smiled proudly at her guest, saying, "Isn't he marvelous?" The pianist bowed slightly, but his eyes moved again to the small figure sitting near the hallway. The little girl was staring at the piano with the same wonder she had before, the kind of look that comes from deep inside, untouched by fear or pride. The pianist spoke softly. "Would you like to try again?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. The room fell silent for a moment. The lady of the house looked surprised. "Oh, really?" she said, laughing. "You want her to play again?" Last time was quite entertaining. A few of the guests chuckled. The maid's face turned red as she shook her head quickly. No, please, she doesn't need to." But the little girl looked up at the pianist, her small voice trembling. "Can I?" Her mother whispered, "No, my dear, please." But the pianist smiled and said, "Yes, if you want to. Play something for your mother again." The lady of the house folded her arms, clearly amused. "Well, I suppose we could use a little entertainment before dessert." The girl hesitated, feeling her legs go weak. The guests were already watching her. She could see their curious faces, their half-smiles, the same kind of laughter that hides behind polite expressions. But somewhere deep inside, she remembered how her mother looked at her that night. Proud, tearful, amazed. She took a slow breath and walked toward the piano. Every step echoed in the silent room. Her small shoes tapped against the polished floor. She climbed onto the stool, her feet dangling once again. The pianist stepped back and gave her space. "Play what you feel," he whispered quietly so only she could hear. She nodded. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the keys. Her heart was pounding, not from fear this time, but from something stronger, something that felt like hope. The first note came soft and shaky. Then another. Slowly the sound began to grow. Her fingers found their rhythm. Her body leaned slightly forward and the melody began to shape itself. It wasn't a song anyone recognized. It wasn't perfect, but there was something in it that made the guests stop talking and lean in. The little girl was lost in her own world now, her face calm, her eyes half closed. The music came not from her hands but from her heart. Her mother stood frozen near the doorway, tears filling her eyes again. Every note felt like a word her daughter couldn't speak. The laughter that had filled the room before was gone now. The air was still. The pianist watched quietly, his expression soft, almost emotional. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then someone started clapping softly. Another joined, and soon the whole room was filled with applause. Real applause this time. Not the kind given to be polite, but the kind that comes from surprise, from being touched by something true. The lady of the house looked genuinely stunned. "Where did she learn that?" she asked, almost to herself. The pianist smiled slightly. "Some people don't need to be taught," he said. "They just feel it." The maid rushed forward, hugging her daughter tightly. "I told you not to," she whispered through tears, "but I'm so proud of you." The girl smiled shyly. "I just wanted to play it for you again." The pianist crouched beside her and asked softly, "Do you play at home?" The girl shook her head. "We don't have a piano. I just listen when I can. My mom's phone has music. I try to copy it on the table when she's cleaning." The guests exchanged glances. Some looked embarrassed, others impressed. The lady of the house blinked, unsure what to say. For the first time, she looked at the maid's daughter not as a servant's child, but as someone extraordinary. After the guests left that night, the maid was cleaning up again. The house was quiet, but her mind wasn't. Her daughter's music still echoed in her ears. She turned to her daughter, who was sitting on the steps, sleepy but smiling. "You made everyone listen," her mother said softly. "Do you know how rare that is?" The girl shrugged gently. "I just played what I felt." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she knelt down and said, "Promise me something. Never let them make you think you can't dream. Not even me. You understand?" The girl nodded. Her eyes sparkled in the dim light. From that night on, everything felt different, even if nothing had changed yet. The lady of the house seemed kinder when she passed by the maid. The pianist left a note on the piano before leaving, a small message written on a folded napkin. It said, "She has a gift. Let her play whenever she wants." When her mother found it the next morning, she read it 3 times, her hands trembling. She didn't know what it would mean or where it would lead, but she tucked the note into her pocket and smiled. The little girl, sitting by the window again, watched the morning light fall across the piano keys. It was quiet, but she didn't mind. In her mind, the music was still playing. The same tune she had made for her mother. The one that had turned laughter into silence. And though she didn't know how, she felt something changing inside her, something brave, something strong. The same people who had once laughed at her had listened this time. And she knew that one day they wouldn't just listen, they would remember. The next few days passed quietly in the large house. The guests had long forgotten the little girl's performance, but for her and her mother, that night had changed everything. Something inside both of them had shifted. The maid still woke up early every morning, packing her old bag and tying her hair before heading out to work. But now, when she looked at her daughter, she saw not just a child, but a spark and a small light that could grow if given the chance. The girl, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about the piano. Every key, every sound, every moment replayed in her mind like a movie she didn't want to end. Sometimes, when her mother was busy dusting or polishing, she would quietly hum the melody she had played that night. It made her feel peaceful, as if the music was living inside her now. One morning, as they walked to the mansion, the girl asked softly, "Do you think I could play again someday?" Her mother smiled weakly. "Maybe," she said, though her eyes looked unsure. "We'll see." When they reached the house, the lady of the house was already giving instructions to the staff. She barely looked at the maid but spoke in her usual clipped tone. "We're expecting an important guest this weekend. Everything must be perfect. There will be more music, more people. The piano will need tuning again." The maid nodded and began her work. As she moved through the hall with her dusting cloth, she noticed the little girl sitting quietly near the piano again. She didn't stop her. Somehow it felt right to let her sit there. Later that day, the pianist came by to check on the instrument. He had heard whispers among the guests about the maid's daughter who could play. He smiled when he saw her again. "Do you remember me?" he asked gently. The girl nodded shyly. "Yes, you told me to play what I felt," he laughed softly. "And you did. Very well." He leaned over the piano, testing a few notes. "You really love this, don't you?" "Yes," she said simply. "I think about it all the time." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Do you have a piano at home?" She shook her head. "No, we can't afford one. I just listen to songs on my mom's phone and try to copy the sounds." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes listening is the best teacher. You have something special. Keep listening." Her mother, who had been wiping the windows, overheard the conversation but stayed quiet. She didn't want to interrupt. Yet hearing his words made her chest tighten. It was a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because someone finally saw what she had always believed. Fear because she didn't know how to give her daughter the chance she deserved. Before leaving, the pianist turned to the maid. "If you don't mind," he said kindly, "I'd like her to play again when the guests arrive this weekend. Just one song. She'll surprise them." The maid hesitated. "Sir, I don't know if that's a good idea." "The lady might not like it," he smiled gently. Leave that to me. When he left, the maid turned to her daughter. You heard him? The girl nodded, her face glowing. He said I could play again. Her mother smiled, but her voice was soft. Only if they allow it. Don't get your hopes too high, my dear. But the girl didn't stop smiling. For her, even the chance of it was enough to keep her dreaming. The weekend came quickly. The mansion buzzed with activity. The cooks were busy in the kitchen. The decorators were fixing the flowers, and the air smelled of perfume and polish. The lady of the house was pacing, making sure every corner gleamed. She wore a bright smile, but her tone was sharp as she gave instructions. When the pianist arrived, he greeted her warmly and said, I'd like to invite someone special to play tonight just for a few minutes. You remember the maid's daughter? The lady's smile faltered. Oh, that child? Again, he nodded. Yes, trust me. I think everyone will appreciate it. She frowned but didn't argue. Fine, but only for a moment. I don't want people thinking we're running a talent show here. That evening, as guests filled the room, the little girl waited quietly near the back with her mother. She was nervous. Her hands were cold, her heart racing. Every sound in the house, laughter, footsteps, music, felt distant. She kept glancing toward the piano, half afraid, half longing. When the pianist finished his first piece, he looked toward her and gave a small nod. Would our young friend like to play something for us? He said aloud. The guests turned, curious. Some smiled, recognizing her from before. Others looked puzzled. The lady of the house forced a polite smile, her hand tightening around her wineglass. The little girl stood up slowly. Her mother whispered, Go ahead. Just breathe. She walked forward, her small steps echoing on the floor. When she reached the piano, she looked around nervously. Dozens of eyes were on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. The pianist whispered, Remember what I said. Play what you feel, she nodded. Then she took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first sound was soft, a gentle note that hung in the air like a whisper. Then another and another. Slowly, a melody began to form. It wasn't the same one she had played before. This one was new, quieter, deeper, full of feeling. The tune rose and fell like a heartbeat. The room fell silent. Every guest stopped talking. The laughter faded. Even the waiters paused at the door. The sound of her music filled the room like light slipping through clouds. It wasn't technical or trained, but it was real, pure and full of emotion. As she played, she thought of her mother, the long days she spent cleaning, the tired eyes that still smiled, the way she whispered, maybe one day. Every note she played was for her. Every chord carried love. Her mother stood near the wall, hands pressed together, tears rolling down her cheeks. She had never felt such pride, not even when she first got the job that kept them alive. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Then, like a wave, the applause began. It wasn't polite this time. It was real, loud, and full of warmth. The lady of the house clapped too, her expression softening as she said, Well, that was truly something. The pianist smiled, looking at the maid and her daughter. Talent can come from anywhere, he said quietly. After the guests left, the maid was helping clean up when the lady of the house approached her. For the first time, her tone wasn't cold. Your daughter is remarkable, she said simply. I didn't expect that. She's gifted. The maid bowed her head. Thank you, ma'am. The lady hesitated for a moment, then said, Let her play sometimes if the piano is free. I don't mind. The maid's eyes widened. Thank you. That means a lot. That night, as they walked home, the girl was unusually quiet. Her mother looked at her and smiled. You did beautifully, she said. Everyone saw it. The girl finally spoke, her voice small but firm. When I play, I feel like I can talk without words. Like the piano understands me. Her mother nodded slowly. Then you must keep playing. They reached their small apartment where the air smelled of soap and cooking rice. The girl sat by the window looking up at the night sky. She could still hear the applause, but more than that, she could feel something new inside her. Confidence. Her mother watched her for a while, then quietly took the folded napkin out of her pocket, the one with the pianist's handwriting. She read it again, whispering the words like a prayer. She has a gift. Let her play whenever she wants. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her old wallet, where she kept their most precious things, a small photo, a bus ticket, and now, this note. Neither of them knew what the future would bring, but that night, as the girl drifted to sleep, Her fingers moved slightly as if still pressing invisible keys. Her mother listened to the soft tapping sound and smiled. The laughter from the guests, the silence that followed, the music that filled the air. It all felt like the beginning of something greater. And somewhere deep inside, they both knew it wasn't just luck or chance. It was destiny quietly unfolding, one note at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life in the big house continued as usual. The maid came every morning carrying her old bag and her tired but warm smile. Her daughter followed quietly, clutching her small notebook filled with scribbles that looked like music. She had started drawing piano keys on paper, practicing finger movements even without sound. It looked like play to anyone else, but for her it was practice. Her way of keeping the music alive when there was no piano near her. The lady of the house had softened since that last evening. Something about the child's playing had touched her. She still gave orders, still wanted everything perfect, but her voice was less sharp. Sometimes she even smiled when she passed by the little girl. "Be careful with the piano," she would say gently, "but you may play when the room is free." For the little girl, those words were more precious than any gift. The moment the house became quiet and the guests were gone, she would sit at the grand piano. Her mother would pause her work for a few minutes, standing near the door just watching. Those short moments made their long days easier. The pianist, who visited once every week to tune the instrument, noticed her growing confidence. He started showing her small things, how to use her fingers properly, how to press softly, how to feel the rhythm. He never charged for it. "Music," he said once, "should be shared freely with those who truly love it." Every time he came, she improved a little more. Her movements became smoother, her ears sharper. The maid could hardly believe how quickly her daughter learned. Sometimes while cleaning the nearby shelves, she would close her eyes and listen. And she felt her heart swell with pride. But not everyone was kind. A few guests who visited often still found it strange to see the maid's daughter sitting at the piano. Some whispered to each other. "It looks odd, doesn't it?" one said softly. "A maid's child playing a grand piano?" The girl heard once and looked down, pretending she didn't. But that night, as she walked home with her mother, she asked quietly, "Why do some people laugh at me when I play?" Her mother sighed, her eyes tired. "Because they don't understand. People often laugh at what they don't understand. You just keep doing what makes your heart full." The girl nodded, though she didn't say anything more. She didn't want to make her mother sad. A few days later, the lady of the house announced a charity event. It would be larger than usual, filled with local artists, business people, and guests from the city. There would be music, food, and a small performance for entertainment. "It's important that everything looks elegant," she told her staff. "The pianist will perform and there will be a few singers." When the pianist came that day, he whispered something to the lady of the house that made her raise her eyebrows. "Her?" she said, glancing toward the maid's daughter. He smiled. "Yes, let her play one song, just one. You'll see." The lady hesitated for a long time, but eventually nodded. "Fine," she said quietly. "But if it goes wrong, you take responsibility." That evening, the pianist found the girl sitting quietly by the piano as usual. "You're going to play again," he said softly. Her eyes widened. "At the party?" He nodded. "I'll be there beside you. Don't think of them. Just play what you feel." When she told her mother, the maid almost dropped her cloth in shock. "You in front of all those people?" The girl smiled nervously. "He asked me to." Her mother's heart filled with both pride and fear. "Then you must promise me, no matter what happens, keep your head high. Whether they clap or not, you play for yourself and for me. Understand?" The girl nodded. "I will." The night of the event arrived. The mansion glittered with light. Expensive cars lined the driveway and laughter spilled out from the open doors. The lady of the house moved gracefully among her guests, smiling, shaking hands, welcoming everyone with charm. The maid worked quietly in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly. Her daughter stayed hidden behind the curtain near the piano, watching the crowd. Her small heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The pianist gave her a reassuring nod. "Just like we practiced," he said softly. As the evening went on, the guests chatted, drank, and listened to light music. Then the host clinked a glass and said, "Now we have something special. A young girl will play a short piece for us tonight." A few guests looked curious, others uninterested. When the maid's daughter stepped out, there was a murmur. Some people recognized her. A few even smiled kindly, but many exchanged doubtful glances. She took her seat slowly, her small legs barely reaching the pedals. The room was full of eyes. She could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on her. Her hands shook as she placed them on the keys. Then she closed her eyes. The first notes came softly, almost like a whisper. They floated through the air, thin and fragile, but as she continued, the sound grew stronger, richer. It was a song she had made herself, one she played at night in her dreams when she imagined a world where no one laughed at her. The melody rose and fell like the wind. It carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. Her small body swayed slightly with the rhythm. She wasn't thinking of the people watching. She wasn't thinking of fear. She was thinking of her mother, the woman who worked all day, whose hands were rough but whose heart was gentle. Every sound told their story, of long days, quiet dreams, and love that never gave up. Slowly, the room began to change. The noise, the chatter, the whispers, and they all faded. The guests leaned forward, caught by the feeling in the music. Even those who had once laughed sat silently, eyes fixed on the little girl. The lady of the house felt something stir inside her, a kind of warmth she hadn't felt in years. She looked toward the maid who stood at the back, her hands pressed against her chest, tears streaming down her face. When the girl finished, the final note hung in the air like a secret. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then came a sound, soft clapping, then more, and suddenly the entire room erupted into applause. It was loud, real, and full of awe. The girl looked up, surprised. Her mother covered her mouth, trying not to cry out loud. The pianist smiled proudly, his eyes shining. The lady of the house stood up and clapped too. That, she said quietly, was the most honest music I've ever heard. People began walking up to the girl, asking her name, telling her how beautiful her playing was. Someone said, "She should be trained professionally." Another said, "That kind of emotion can't be taught." The maid stood to the side, wiping her tears. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. For years, she had worried her daughter would be overlooked, that people would never see beyond her uniform, her job. But tonight, the same people who once laughed now looked at her daughter with respect. When the guests finally began to leave, the pianist knelt beside the girl and said softly, "You did it. You didn't just play music, and you made them feel." The lady of the house approached and placed a hand on the maid's shoulder. "Your daughter is truly gifted," she said kindly. "I didn't realize before. If she ever needs to practice, the piano is hers." The maid could hardly speak. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as they walked home under the quiet stars, the girl carried herself differently. There was no fear in her step, no hesitation in her smile. She was still the same child, still the maid's daughter, but she now knew something the world hadn't expected her to know, that her talent could touch hearts no matter where she came from. Her mother walked beside her, holding her hand tightly. "You see?" she said softly. "You didn't need fancy lessons or rich clothes. You just needed to believe." The girl smiled up at her. "I played it for you," she whispered. Her mother stopped, kneeling down so she was eye level with her daughter. "And I heard every note," she said. "You made the whole world listen." When they reached home, the girl sat by the small window looking out at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter, closer. She closed her eyes and imagined the piano keys again, each one glowing like light. In her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. Something inside her had awakened that night. She didn't know what the future would hold. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop playing, and somewhere, back in that grand house, the piano waited too. No longer just an instrument, but a witness to a story that had turned laughter into silence and silence into music. The next morning, the sunlight streamed softly through the thin curtains of their small room. The maid's daughter woke early, her heart still filled with the music from the night before. She could still feel the soft keys under her fingers, the sound of applause echoing faintly in her mind. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt alive, like she had stepped into a world that finally noticed her. Her mother was already up, quietly boiling water for tea. She looked over and smiled. "Did you sleep?" The girl nodded. "A little. I kept hearing the song in my head." Her mother chuckled softly. "That's how you know it came from your heart." She poured her tea and sat down beside her daughter. "You made me so proud yesterday. You made everyone listen." The girl's smile was shy but full of warmth. "Do you think they really liked it?" "I saw it with my own eyes," her mother replied. "Even the ones who used to look down on us. They couldn't look away." For a few seconds they sat quietly, the sound of the kettle filling the silence. It was a rare, peaceful morning. But deep inside, the maid knew that things might not stay the same. People talked, stories spread, and soon their lives would change again, in ways she couldn't yet imagine. That very afternoon, a car arrived outside their small home. The sound of the horn startled both of them. Her mother wiped her hands and stepped outside. The lady of the house stood there, elegant as always, but with a kind smile this time. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said gently. The maid shook her head nervously. "No, madam, please come in." The lady entered and looked around the modest home, the cracked walls, the small piano sketch pinned to the wall, and the little stool near the window. She noticed the girl sitting quietly with her notebook on her lap. The lady turned toward her. "You played beautifully last night," she said softly. "You touched everyone's heart." The girl looked down, her cheeks turning pink. "Thank you," the lady continued. "After you left, several guests asked about you. They wanted to know who you were, who taught you, and if you had ever trained." The maid's eyes widened slightly. "We can't afford any training, madam. She only plays when she can." The lady nodded. "I understand, but I think that's about to change. One of the guests from last night runs a small music foundation. They help children with talent, especially those who can't afford lessons. He asked if he could meet your daughter." The room fell silent. The girl's eyes grew wide with disbelief. "Me?" she whispered. "Yes, you." The lady smiled. "He said he hasn't heard playing that pure in years." The maid covered her mouth, overwhelmed. She had worked her whole life cleaning homes, scrubbing floors, always keeping her head down. Now her daughter, the same little girl who once pretended to play on tables, was being offered a real chance. The lady continued kindly. "If you agree, I'll arrange everything. She can take lessons twice a week. The foundation will cover the costs." The maid blinked back tears. I don't know what to say." "Just say yes," the lady said with a gentle smile. "Some people are born to do something special. Your daughter is one of them." The girl stood up and ran to her mother, hugging her tightly. The maid wrapped her arms around her, whispering softly, "You see, my little one, hard work always finds its light." That week, the girl went to the city for the first time to meet the man from the foundation. He was an elderly musician with kind eyes and hair as white as snow. He listened carefully as she played a short piece on a small piano in the corner of his office. When she finished, he leaned back and smiled. "You play with heart," he said simply. "That can't be taught. But the rest, the technique, the polish, we can teach you. Would you like to learn?" The girl nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir." From that day on, her life began to shift. Twice a week, after helping her mother in the mornings, she traveled to the city. She practiced scales, learned to read music properly, and spent hours understanding each note, each movement. Her fingers grew stronger, her posture straighter. But it wasn't just about lessons. She began to discover herself, the way her emotions flowed through her music. Sometimes after class, she would sit quietly and play her favorite melodies, imagining her mother sitting in front of her, listening. Her teacher often said, "Music is not about showing how good you are. It's about sharing what you feel." She never forgot those words. Meanwhile, the people in the big house had started looking at her differently. The ones who once whispered behind her back now greeted her with warm smiles. The lady often asked her to play when guests visited, and every time she did, the room fell silent, just like that first night. Her mother continued to work, though she was now treated with a little more respect. The staff no longer looked at her as just another maid. She had become known as the mother of the little pianist. Still, she never let pride take over. Every evening, when she and her daughter walked home, she reminded her, Always stay humble, no matter how far you go. Never forget where you started. The girl listened carefully, nodding every time. I won't forget, Mama, she said. Months passed and her progress astonished everyone. Her teacher arranged for her to perform at a small recital with other students. It was her first time performing outside the mansion, and this time the audience was full of musicians, not social guests. Backstage, she was nervous again. Her hands trembled slightly. Her mother sat beside her, squeezing her hand gently. Just play like you always do, she whispered. Pretend it's only you and me in the room. When her name was called, she walked to the stage. The lights were bright, the crowd silent. She sat at the piano and closed her eyes for a moment, just like she always did before playing. The first note came softly, then the next, and soon the hall was filled with music that carried the same honesty she had that night in the mansion. Her touch was delicate yet powerful, each sound carrying emotion that no words could express. When she finished, there was a long silence, then applause, real and thunderous. She looked up and saw her mother in the back row, clapping proudly with tears in her eyes. After the performance, her teacher walked up to her and said, "That was not just good, that was sincere. You have something very few people do." Her story began to spread quietly, through musicians, teachers, and even the local paper. They wrote about the young girl who played from the heart. Back in the mansion, the lady received calls from people asking if the story was true. "Yes," she told them proudly. "She was my maid's daughter. But now she's more than that. She's a musician." The girl herself didn't care about fame. What made her happiest was the smile on her mother's face. Every time she played, she felt like she was giving her something back, a reward for all the sacrifices she had made. One evening, after a long day of practice, she sat beside her mother on their small porch. The sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange. The air smelled of rain. "Do you think Grandma would have liked my music?" the girl asked suddenly. Her mother looked at her, surprised by the question. "She would have loved it," she said. "She used to hum songs when I was your age. Maybe that's where you got it from." The girl smiled softly. "Sometimes when I play, I feel like she's listening too." Her mother placed her arm around her shoulders. "Maybe she is," she whispered. They sat in silence, watching the evening fall. For the first time in a long time, the maid didn't worry about the next day, the bills, or the work waiting for her. She just felt proud. Proud of her daughter. Proud of the music that had changed both their lives. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The months that followed were filled with music, learning, and growth. The little girl had changed, not in her heart, but in the way she carried herself. She walked with quiet confidence now, her head held a little higher, her steps lighter. She still helped her mother before lessons, still washed the dishes, still hummed songs as she worked. But there was something new in her eyes, a spark that came from knowing she was meant for something more. Her teacher had started preparing her for a bigger performance. It wasn't just another recital this time. It was a youth piano competition held in the city's grand concert hall. Musicians from different schools, academies, and even private tutors were coming to perform. It was the kind of stage that frightened even experienced players. When he told her about it, she froze. "A competition?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," he said gently. "It's time for people to hear you. Don't think of it as a contest. Think of it as a chance to share your story." Her mother was nervous too. "Are you sure she's ready for that kind of crowd?" she asked him. He smiled kindly. "She's ready in ways that can't be taught." The next few weeks became a blur of practice. Every day after finishing her small chores, the girl would go to the piano room at the mansion, practicing until her fingers ached. The lady of the house often peeked in quietly, smiling as she listened. Sometimes, she would bring her snacks or tea and leave them on the table without saying a word, just letting her play. The music filled every corner of that grand house. The same house where laughter once mocked her now stood still when she played. The same piano that was once forbidden had now become her closest friend. Her mother often sat in a corner, stitching clothes or polishing silver while her daughter practiced. Every now and then she would whisper softly, "Slow down, my dear. Don't wear yourself out," but the girl only smiled. "I want to make you proud." You already have, her mother said quietly. More than you know. Finally, the day of the competition came. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the city was already awake when they stepped out. The maid wore her best dress, though it was still simple and faded from years of washing. The girl wore a clean white dress that the lady of the house had gifted her the night before. It's not about looking rich, the lady had said. It's about looking ready. When they reached the hall, the sight took their breath away. It was enormous, with golden lights, tall curtains, and rows upon rows of shining seats. The sound of tuning pianos echoed faintly through the space. Children in neat uniforms stood with their parents, some chatting confidently, others practicing their scales on imaginary keys. The maid's daughter stayed close to her mother, her small hand clutching hers tightly.
"Mama," she whispered, "what if I make a mistake?"
Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then you keep going, because even mistakes can sound beautiful if you play with heart." When it was her turn, she walked slowly to the stage. The lights blinded her for a moment, but she took a deep breath and remembered what her teacher always said. Don't play to impress them. Play to tell them who you are. She sat down, her small figure almost swallowed by the grand piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys. For a second, the noise of the crowd disappeared and she imagined her mother sitting right there beside her, smiling. Then she began. The first few notes came soft, gentle like a whisper from her soul. Then the melody grew stronger, warmer, a mix of joy and pain, of childhood and hope. Every note seemed to tell a piece of her story. The long days cleaning floors, the laughter she once heard behind her, the nights she dreamed of music she couldn't afford to play. Her hands moved with grace and emotion. She didn't look at the audience, didn't worry about the judges. She just played. The music swelled and carried through the hall like a wave. Even the air seemed to pause to listen. Parents held their breath. The judges leaned forward. And in that moment, there was no maid's daughter, no competition, only music that touched something deep inside everyone. When the final note faded, there was silence. Then the entire hall erupted into applause, just like that night in the mansion, but louder, bigger, realer. The sound washed over her and she froze for a moment, blinking in disbelief. Her mother stood in the audience, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't clap right away. She just stared at her daughter, hands over her heart, unable to move. It was the same feeling she had when she first heard her play years ago. The feeling that her child was meant for something greater than their world could imagine. When the results were announced later, her name was called as the winner, but she didn't jump or scream. She walked up slowly, accepted the small golden trophy with shaking hands, and turned toward her mother in the crowd. That moment, the smile they shared, meant more than any award ever could. After the ceremony, reporters came to take pictures. They wanted to know her story, to write about the maid's daughter who won hearts through her music. One of them asked her, "Who inspired you to play?" She looked at her mother and said softly, "My mom. She's the one who gave me everything, even when she had nothing." The story spread quickly. Newspapers, local TV, social media. People from around the country read about her. Donations came in for her training. Letters arrived, some from musicians who wanted to mentor her, some from children who said her story gave them courage. The lady of the house proudly showed everyone the article that featured the picture of the girl sitting at her piano. "This is the same piano," she said. "I always knew it had a song waiting to be played." Life slowly changed. The maid still worked, but less now. The foundation arranged a scholarship for her daughter to study music full-time. Soon she was invited to perform in another city, and then another. Her name began appearing on small concert posters. Every time she went on stage, she played with the same honesty. Not to impress, but to share. And every time her mother was there, sitting in the front row, quietly holding her bag on her lap, eyes glistening. Years passed, and the little girl grew into a young woman. Her music reached further, small towns, cities, and eventually beyond the country. She performed for people who didn't even speak her language, but still understood her through her music. One day, after a performance abroad, she sat in her dressing room holding a letter. It was from her old piano teacher, written in shaky handwriting. It read, "You reminded the world what real music feels like. Don't ever lose that." She smiled, pressing the letter to her chest. When she returned home after her final tour, she went straight to the small house where it all began. Her mother was sitting by the window, older now, but still with that same kind face. The piano she practiced on at the mansion had been replaced years ago, but the lady of the house had gifted the old one to her. It stood proudly in their small living room, worn, scratched, but full of memories. The young woman walked over to it, sat down, and ran her fingers gently across the keys. Her mother watched, her eyes soft and full. "Do you remember?" the daughter said quietly. "When they laughed at me for touching this?" Her mother nodded with a smile. "I remember. And now the whole world listens when you play." The young woman looked up, her eyes shining. "I still play for you," she said softly. Her mother reached out, placing a hand over hers. "And I still hear every note," she whispered. The daughter smiled and began to play again, not for fame, not for crowds, but for love. The same song that had once filled the mansion now filled their little home. It was slower now, gentler, filled with gratitude and peace. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky gold. Neighbors walking by stopped to listen. Some didn't know who lived there, but they could feel the emotion in the music. Inside, the maid's daughter played, and her mother listened, just as they had always done. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the music, their story lived forever. A story of dreams that refused to die, of love that never gave up, and of a song that began with a question. "Can I play it for my mom?"